This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 654 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Before getting into the mailbag questions this week, I want to give a shout to the Establish the Run podcast. The podcast is free, and it's hosted by two legends in the fantasy football space, Adam Levitan and Evan Silva. You probably remember them from their time at RotoWorld. Establish the Run episodes are quick, fun, and packed with analysis. They cover fantasy news and reactions, rankings, how to bet player props, best ball, and more. As I've been saying, I think it's a great compliment to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast because it's more conversational in nature, and they cover topics that I might not cover. I'm a longtime listener. I can vouch that they know what they're talking about. So check out the Establish the Run podcast anywhere you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for FanDuel Fantasy. For users who have yet to make a deposit on FanDuel Fantasy, you can deposit today to receive 2 free entries. All you have to do is deposit a minimum of $10 in your FanDuel DFS account. You'll be instantly rewarded with 2 free vouchers. Be sure to deposit now and play for free. Head over to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel Fantasy app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Go to FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app for more details. The first question this week is from Patreon, and it's from Clay. It says, "Hi JJ, Denver has a brand new situation in both quarterback and play caller. Nate Tice lovingly refers to Russell Wilson-led offenses as, quote, where tight ends go to die. My question to you is, do we fade the Denver tight ends because Wilson historically doesn't use them? Or put differently, in your analysis, how much weight is put into quarterback tendencies versus play calling? Or in this specific case, the unknown of a new regime's play calling." I actually don't know if I totally agree with this idea that Russell Wilson doesn't target tight ends or use tight ends. Russell Wilson entered the league in 2012, and since that point in time, the Seahawks averaged a 21.7% tight end target share per season. That's actually about a full percentage point above the league average during this time frame. And during this time, unsurprisingly, 3 of the 4 best adjusted target share seasons, that's target share adjusted for games played, 3 of the 4 best came from Jimmy Graham in that offense, who was the best tight end objectively that Russell Wilson has ever had. Now, Graham was never elite or anything like that in Seattle, and maybe that was somewhat based on the offense or based on Russell Wilson, but he also just wasn't the same type of player, or exactly the same type of player that he was in New Orleans. But overall, I don't know if tight ends are automatically terrible with Russell Wilson. And not only that, but I found that there is correlation in fantasy football between late round tight ends or tight ends drafted in the middle rounds as well and elite quarterback play. I just don't think that there's necessarily enough evidence to say that Russell Wilson doesn't like tight ends. As it pertains to projections, though, I'm a believer that good players earn volume or some baseline volume. So if Alberto is good, he should be fine. And at tight end, a player can hit a 16% target share and still be viable if they're efficient enough, which Alberto might be, because last year he was 6th in yards per route run at tight end among the 45 tight ends with 30 or more targets. So if that translates and Alberto is a really good player, then I would expect target share to still go his way. But competition and the ambiguity surrounding Wilson and his tendencies, that's definitely why a player like Alberto is a late round pick right now. So to answer your question directly, I consider everything. I do think there are some tendencies that are hard to ignore. But this one with Russ and with tight ends, I'm not sure that's something that you'd want to weigh heavily when deciding whether or not to draft Alberto. This next question is from @Don Kamuna. It says, "What are your takes on Chase Edmonds? Seems to be a polarizing player in the fantasy community." So I realized that someone had asked me about Chase Edmonds last week, and I said that I would go over it on Monday's show, and then I didn't go over it. But if you didn't listen to that breakout running back show from earlier in the week, go do that now. Because Edmonds does fit a lot of that criteria. He's an RB1 and he's in an ambiguous backfield. He's a pass catcher. He's not past his 5th NFL season. Like, do I think that he's someone who's going to be a league-winning player? Like, do I think that Chase Edmonds has the same upside as Tony Pollard? No, I don't think so. But I do think that if you're looking for a player who can exceed ADP and that expectation where he's being drafted, if you just want value, Edmonds makes plenty of sense, especially in full PPR. He's someone who should be able to hit a double-digit percentage target share in that offense. And if he gets over the 120 or 130 rush attempt mark, then you're in business. And we know Raheem Mostert hasn't been the healthiest running back through the years. The next question is from @StudsandScrubs. It says, is the recent trend of one rookie running back finishing in the top 10 most years signal or noise? Can the process make a bull case out of Breece Hall, given the selection of high upside rookie backs is slim? So I don't think I would just solely draft off of a statistic that shows that a rookie running back consistently finishes in the top 10. But it does let you know that you obviously shouldn't just go the other direction, that rookies can be impactful. And I talked about this on the running back dead zone episode from last month. And even Monday's episode sort of talked about this. But age is important. When you compare player success and production to how the market viewed that player, the market is generally undervaluing younger, unproven players in redraft leagues. But those players generally have a lot of talent. I'm very much in on Breece Hall this year. It's not because so many running backs have finished in the top 10 historically. I mean, that's fine and good to know and all that, but it's because he's being pushed down in ADP, essentially because of Michael Carter and the overall situation on offense. How do I know this? Because if that backfield was only by himself, if he was alone in that backfield, people would probably draft Hall closer to where they drafted Najee Harris last year. Maybe not quite as high, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was like an early 3rd round pick. But over on Fantasy Pros, he's a 4th rounder. And best ball drafts, he's a 4th round pick. My hypothesis as to why rookie running backs tend to do well out of the dead zone is that the dead zone is driven by opportunity and not talent. Managers force the pick. They force inferior talent onto their fantasy rosters because they're trying to fill the running back position. But those players in the dead zone are just projected to see high volume. They're not studs. They're not locked into these roles. Think about Mike Davis last year. That's a huge reason I was fading Davis last season. But with rookies, they're in the dead zone because of ambiguity. People are afraid that they're not good, or they're afraid that they won't see a big workload because they're first-year players. But if we use our evidence, like my model, where Breece Hall got drafted, all of that kind of evidence, it shows us that Hall has a lot of talent. So I'm more than fine taking him this year because I believe talent can win out in a big way when a player is this good. I actually just took him in the Scott Fish Bowl. So draft Breece Hall. This next question is from Ryan. It says, JJ, love the show. Thanks. I also love being part of the Patreon community. Awesome. I know how you feel about the Giants in general this season, and also about Kadarius Toney, but I was curious what your outlook on Wan'Dale Robinson is. The Giants went to go get him in the 2nd round when it seemed like he was going to be a 3rd round plus guy. Yeah, so spoiler alert, but Wan'Dale Robinson, he's one of my late round dart throws in the late round draft guide, which you can purchase over on lateround.com right now. My model really liked Robinson, but he was undersized. I talked about this on the show. There's at least some concern there, but I'm still higher than the consensus on Wan'Dale Robinson. And I know that because he's on a lot of my dynasty rosters right now. As you said, the Giants picked Robinson pretty early in the draft. And Robinson was Pro Football Focus's 3rd best slot receiver last year. And the Giants' main slot guy, Sterling Shepard, is recovering from an Achilles injury. It's really hard to imagine a late season Achilles not getting in Shepard's way this year. Kadarius Toney can play the slot too, but he can also move to the outside. So I'm envisioning Wan'Dale being their slot guy right away. And if Toney busts or if Toney isn't what they want, because remember, this regime didn't draft Kadarius Toney, then that's even better news for Wan'Dale Robinson. So yes, I'm in on Robinson in all fantasy formats. This next question is from Paxman from Patreon. It says, hey JJ, I need your help. The consensus is much higher on AJ Brown than I am. This is making me worry about DeVonta Smith. I thought Smith had a very good rookie year, but I'm worried that Jalen can't support 2 fantasy wide receivers. And if the Eagles are going to be a run-first team, is Smith a value, or should I be fading him for other options at his ADP? So I talked about this on the team regression episode, and it's in the guide as well, but I fully expect the Eagles to be more pass-heavy this year for a ton of reasons. Maintaining their run rates from the second half of last year is going to be really, really difficult. And yes, there's plenty of worry with Hurts at quarterback. It's not like he's a proven passer or anything. But I think in situations like this, we just have to expand our minds a little bit and think about the variety of outcomes that can occur here. I fully expect AJ Brown to perform better than DeVonta Smith. But there's a non-zero chance that Smith ends up with a higher target share in this offense. And guys, please don't stretch that and take it the wrong way. I'm not projecting that. I'm merely saying that a second-year wide receiver who won the Heisman, was a top half first-round pick, had a sweet production profile, and had a really underrated rookie season. I'm just saying that it's not impossible compared to a guy who's shifting teams. And I love A.J. Brown. And I'll be getting to this on next week's Breakout Wide Receiver Show. But second-year middle-round wide receivers are awesome. Even if the projection for DeVonta Smith looks more like a wide receiver 3, you've got to remember that variance exists. And you should use these other things that have won in that ADP range historically. Because I'm a believer in DeVonta Smith, the talent. I'm still in. I talked about this on the show around draft time. That when the Eagles got A.J. Brown is a perfect time to buy DeVonta Smith because he's a good player. But I'm still in because I know my team level projection for Philly can be wrong. And I know there's still a chance that Hurts takes a step forward as a quarterback, as a passer. It's not like you're spending a 4th round pick to get DeVonta Smith. He's being ranked 87th overall over on Fantasy Pros right now in half PPR formats. I have him like 25 spots ahead of that. That's partially because I favor wide receivers in my rankings, but even within the position, I have Smith at wide receiver 30. Rankers have him at wide receiver 35. So I'm in with the understanding that it's not all butterflies and rainbows situationally. It's just that when we're not talking about the extremes, like when we're not talking about an offense that's bound to be run in a really conservative way that objectively limits the upside of its players, I'm going to lean into player talent pretty heavily. That talent creates a nice baseline for opportunity. This last question is from @SkullActuary. It says, why should I take Garrett Wilson over Sky Moore in a rookie draft? Vegas lines have Sky superior to Wilson in many categories, and he has a locked-in quarterback. If they produce equally, won't Sky be viewed higher in the offseason? Thanks. So these questions, the last one, this one, and the final one, which is next, they all follow a similar theme, and that theme is talent versus situation. Situation matters in fantasy football. I build projections. I see it firsthand every single year. I know that situation matters. But it's very, very easy to overstate situation. You can think about this with anything in your life, any sort of competition. I'm sure 99% of you have played cornhole before. In cornhole, you're throwing 4 bags per round, right? Imagine a world where you're only throwing 2 of them, but your opponent is still throwing 4. Your situation sucks. Your opponent's situation is great because your opponent is facing someone who's only throwing 2 bags per round. Okay, now imagine your opponent is my soon-to-be 4-year-old daughter who can't even throw the beanbag far enough to hit the board. Even if my daughter has 100 bags, you're still going to win with just 2. Because from a talent perspective, she's not there yet. She physically cannot do it. Someday she'll be there because her dad loves him some cornhole. He's going to undoubtedly play with her all the time. But the talent side of the equation matters. Now that's obviously an extreme example, but far too often, people act like there's no talent discrepancy between players, when there absolutely is all the time. Sky Moore is a good prospect. My model liked Sky Moore. I like him a lot. But Garrett Wilson was exceptionally good. He rated a lot better in that model, which doesn't factor in team landing spot or situation. So yeah, you can bump Sky Moore up just a little bit for the fact that he's going to be playing with Patrick Mahomes. But it's not like every wide receiver who's ever played with Patrick Mahomes has been good. In fact, most of them haven't been fantasy relevant. And it's because of talent. You think that if Patrick Mahomes had Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, and Justin Jefferson, that Jefferson would be performing like Mecole Hardman? Of course not. Jefferson would be crushing because he's super, super talented. And this isn't a knock on Sky Moore. Like I said, I like Moore. You just asked a question about him compared to a very good prospect in Garrett Wilson. Being a better player matters in fantasy football because it can mean better efficiency, but more importantly, it can mean more volume. Volume is what matters in fantasy football, and volume is what's given to players who are good at the game. Situation can give us some sort of baseline, and it can give a player some sort of ceiling too, like Darnell Mooney. Darnell Mooney is over on Chicago without a whole lot of competition. Chances are he's going to have a nice target share floor and ceiling, sure. But Mooney still has to be good in order to see that volume. If that wasn't the case, then why wouldn't we just project Byron Pringle and N'Keal Harry to see similar volume? is because Mooney is far superior as a player. Looking at projected lines for this season isn't really going to help you in Dynasty because things change and those numbers are not always right. What if Zach Wilson is awesome? Or what if he sucks and the Jets get an awesome quarterback? You should always be leading with talent for that reason too. This isn't to say that Sky Moore will not be better than Garrett Wilson. Of course that's possible. This is a probability-driven game. It's just that when you approach the game in a particular way, if you lead with talent before situation, and you do that with every single player, you're going to win out in the long run. Now, the last question this week is from ghound1189 from Patreon. It says, "Hi, JJ, love the pod and all your data-driven content. Thank you. I believe you have said you generally prefer to avoid middle-round tight ends. However, how do you feel about Dalton Schultz this year? Feels like he is set up for a sizable target share, and he's proven that he can be successful already. Mark Andrews in the middle rounds last year helped me win my league, so I'm wondering if it's worth taking that risk again. Thanks." So this is another example of this intersection of talent and situation. A lot of people call it talent and opportunity, but opportunity is given to talented players. It's more talent and situation. Now, I had a long Twitter thread about Dalton Schultz on Wednesday because his ADP is getting really, really high. Basically, the main argument I see for Schultz right now is that he was the tight end 3 in total scoring last year at tight end, and his situation only got better. That was one of the main arguments people said in my mentions when I was tweeting about Dalton Schultz. And that's not wrong. There's less in the way for volume right now with Amari Cooper gone, Michael Gallup being banged up. There's a lot less in the way for Dalton Schultz. Who else is Dak Prescott going to throw to? And he was the tight end 3 in total points last year. But there's a lot of context missing here. Yes, he was the tight end 3, but we've got to start using points per game as our go-to for this kind of analysis. He was the tight end 5 in half PPR points per game. And the tight end 9, Dallas Goedert, scored less than 1 point per game below Schultz last year. Schultz himself was 8th in the league in tight end target share. But when you look at tight ends who played more than 8 games last season, and you look at target share per game, he was 13th. Players like Dallas Goedert, Noah Fant, Mike Gesicki, Cole Kmet, they all had higher target share per game rates than Dalton Schultz. Yards per route run. Schultz was completely middle of the pack in both yards per route run and targets per route run among 50-plus target tight ends. He was fine last year, but he wasn't consistently posting elite numbers and elite peripherals. And I'm not even sitting here saying that Dalton Schultz is bad. I think Schultz is a good tight end, and he's still tight end 6 in my rankings. But this is another problem. We've got to stop only looking at where you have players ranked within their position. I may have Schultz at tight end 6, and he's being drafted as the tight end 6. But I still have him valued far past his ADP. Because I don't see the same gap between him and someone like Dallas Goedert or even TJ Hawkinson. The gap exists, sure. That's why I have him at tight end 6. But in best ball drafts right now, Dalton Schultz is going 30 picks before Dallas Goedert. 30. And that's not 30 late round picks. Those are 30 middle round picks. The opportunity cost there is big. But my argument for Schultz is not a floor argument. I think Schultz is a pretty good bet to finish as like a top 8 tight end this year. My argument is a ceiling one. Because with the tight end position, a position where you only need one in a normal starting lineup in fantasy, you really, really need difference makers. In most cases in fantasy, you don't want to draft a player for him to just meet expectation. But with tight ends specifically, where there's just such a big gap after the elite players, you should be striving to get a player who's elite. Now, I have a chart in the late round draft guide that shows each round in the fantasy draft versus the frequency that a tight end from that round has hit a certain points per game threshold. So for example, 50% of round 1 tight ends since 2011 have hit 16 PPR points per game. About 42% of round 10 tight ends have hit 12 PPR points per game. One thing that's totally obvious from that chart is how tight ends drafted in the double-digit rounds are often outproducing tight ends drafted in the middle rounds. And that's especially true when those middle round tight ends aren't the first pass catcher being drafted from their team, like Mark Andrews was last year. But I'll get to that more in the breakout tight ends episode. The point is, middle round tight ends drafted between round 6 and 9, they've historically been pretty bad bets, which is another reason to not buy into the ADP bump for Dalton Schultz. And I don't think fantasy managers always can grasp how difficult it is for a tight end to be a huge difference maker. Over the last 3 seasons, the tight end 3 in fantasy football, if we assume the tight end 3 is giving you some sort of edge, that player has averaged 12.3 half PPR points per game. Just for reference, Schultz was under 10 last year. He was at like 9.99 half PPR points per game. Using that 12.3 points per game threshold, we've had 27 instances where a tight end has hit that since 2011. Last year, the 2 that hit that were Travis Kelce and Mark Andrews, because again, we're looking for elite players at the position, difference makers. Now, of those 27, we had 14 unique tight ends, because players are hitting this mark more than once. 10 did it once, 4 did it more than once. George Kittle is one of the players who has done it more than once. He's done it 3 times, actually. And Kittle right now is going just a round ahead of Dalton Schultz in best ball drafts. But let's take this a step further. Among these seasons, the average target share per game rate was 23.1%. So of our elite tight ends, they average a target share per game of about 23%. And over 63% of these players were over a 22% target share. But then on top of that, the lowest yards per route run rate among these 27 instances was 1.72. Schultz was at 1.47 last year, by far a career high. So maybe you feel optimistic about situation for Dalton Schultz, that because of the lack of competition, he can get to that 22% target share. Now, I'd say that's pretty optimistic considering he averaged a target share per game of 17% without Amari Cooper in the lineup for 2 games last year, but let's just run with it. Let's be optimistic. If he gets to that 22% target share mark, he's also going to have to really improve in yards per route run. Schultz just doesn't profile as one of the typical elite difference-making tight ends that we've seen in the past, right? Like, we can all agree there. He's not George Kittle or Darren Waller or Travis Kelce or Mark Andrews even physically. He's more like a player like Zach Ertz. And Zach Ertz, by the way, he did make that list, that elite list. He made it once back in 2018. But it took Ertz a 26.5% target share that year to get there. That's the 3rd highest tight end target share season since 2011. Is that really what we want to bank on? And not only that, but what happens when Michael Gallup returns? What happens if Jalen Tolbert emerges as a rookie, especially during the second half of the season? That's when we know rookie wideouts see better production. All of a sudden, during the biggest time of the fantasy football season, the second half of the year, the playoffs, the championship, Dalton Schultz has more competition for targets. So the argument about situation is at least weakened because Michael Gallup would return and there's a possible emergence of another wide receiver in this lineup. I can't drive this point home enough. Historically in fantasy football, like we have so much data on this, but historically in fantasy football, you absolutely do not want your middle round tight ends to just meet expectation. You need a ceiling. It's why having a stars and scrubs approach to the position each year makes so much sense. I just don't see Schultz having that ceiling. I think he can finish in the top 8. I think he could even finish in the top 5 in points per game if things don't go the way that we think they're going to go with the other top 5 tight ends, or if they deal with an injury or something. But there's no reason, according to my projections, according to my research, that he should be drafted ahead of some of the elite quarterbacks this year and some of the really talented second-year wide receivers. And that's what's happening right now. It's just a really tough one to buy into. That's why Schultz's ADP needs to drop before I draft him, even though I do still have him at tight end 6. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Remember to check out lateround.com for the draft guide, the Late Round Fantasy Football newsletter, which is free, the Patreon, all that good stuff. It's almost draft season. Make sure that you're set up to win. Enjoy your weekend, though. I'll talk to you next week.